Well, good morning, everybody. Today is Monday, June 8th, and this is the Miller-Johnson Coronavirus COVID-19 Response Team Daily Webinar. My name is Sandy Andre, and I am joined by my friend and colleague, Mary Tabin. We are attorneys in the firm's employment section, and today we're going to be talking to you a little bit about two new executive orders that were issued midday on Friday, Executive Order 114 and Executive Order 115, talking to you a little bit about how those impact your work life and impact your social life. But before we get started on the nuts and bolts of either of these orders, just want to share a couple pieces of good news from over the weekend in the COVID-19 realm. So the good news is Michigan's total number of coronavirus cases continues to decline. So that is good information and helpful. And provides a lot of optimism that these executive orders and the numbers are going in the direction that we all want. However, as we know, over the weekend, the U.S. Death toll related to COVID-19 surpassed 110,000. So again, certainly continue to be sobering numbers, but hopefully we are headed in the right direction as it relates to the virus. So switching gears, let's go ahead and talk about, let's go ahead and dive into our presentation talking about Executive Order 115 and 114. So in terms of our topics today, we're going to spend just a couple of moments of time on Executive Order 110. So if you're tuning in this morning, you're not having deja vu, although it feels like you may have also started your Friday morning with Mary and I talking about Executive Order 110. This is indeed a different presentation with some new updates. And so some of the pieces in 110 have not gone away, and so we want to distinguish through those pieces as well, and then talk about the nuts and bolts of both 115 and 114. Okay, next slide, please. Let's first start with a short refresher about Executive Order 110, right? On Friday, we talked to you about that order that was originally issued on June 1st, so last Monday. And it had several pieces that took immediate effect and then some staggered lifting of those stay-at-home restrictions. Some took effect on June 4th last week, but a couple of those take effect today. So last Friday we were talking to you, hey, remember on Monday, here's the things that are happening, right? And so of that list, we're talking about restaurants and bars, right? They get to, this is all regions, get to open to in-person seating subject to capacity limits. Outdoor public swimming pools, same, open with capacity limits. Day camps, libraries, and museums, all of those pieces start to open subject to some workplace safeguards and capacity restrictions. However, there was a list in 110 of certain businesses that were to remain closed across the state. And that list is there on your screen. Theaters, cinemas, performance venues, indoor gyms, fitness centers, exercise facilities and the like, personal care service facilities, and casinos. So remember, on Friday, we talked a lot about the way that you should start to think about 110 and how that was different from its predecessor stay-at-home orders, in that the previous orders were everything stops except for these very specifically articulated things. So it was the order that you had to find your job or your industry in that order to say, yep, there we are. That's how I know we can operate. 110 kind of shifted, or we need to think about it as a shifting in our mind to say it's shifted from, unless you're specifically talked about in the order, you can't operate, to everybody can operate subject to certain restrictions unless you're specifically indicated in the order as not being able to operate. So that remain closed list there is what remained in 110, And we knew that that meant that the entire state had shifted to phase 4 of the My Safe Start program, and we talked about that there are 6 phases and all of those pieces. So 110 is still important, and we want to continue to think about that. For those who are listening who haven't had a chance to think about 110 all that much, go ahead and hop back on our website and watch the Friday presentation on demand, because it is still applicable, and we'll talk about why it's still really important in just a second here. But for now, let's go ahead and shift to Executive Order 115. So what I will tell you is that Executive Order 115 is not the new pink, right? It is not necessarily the new Executive Order 110. So of course we have Elwoods here in a classic, right? Whoever said orange is the new pink was seriously disturbed. So whoever is out there saying that 115 is the new 110 is not necessarily correct. So let's talk about why. So Executive Order 115, I'm just going to refer to that as a stay-at-home order, right? Just like 115 is a stay-at-home order, Executive Order 96 was a stay-at-home order. I kind of just want to use that vernacular so we know generally what type of contents we're talking about, okay? But very importantly and differently from its predecessors, it does not rescind Executive Order 110. So usually we see that right in the heading or right in the beginning of that order, that this one takes the place of this one, so this old one has gone away. 115 does not say that about Executive Order 110, okay? As I mentioned, it was issued mid-morning on Friday, June 5th, and took immediate effect. But what is a little bit tricky here is that what immediate effect means is 2 things. There are 2 dates that are issued, that are mentioned in Executive Order 110. And so those are the pieces that we're going to look to say, okay, how does this impact me and my work and my job and my social life, all those pieces. So on June 10th, Regions 6 and 8 are permitted to move to Phase 5 of the Michigan Safe Start Plan. And on June 10th, Regions 6 and 8, because of that shift, they then are permitted to transition from the rules for operation and capacity limitations that currently exist in Executive Order 110 to the rules that now exist in Executive Order 115 related to capacity limits and operation requirements, those pieces, okay? So that's the first piece. The second piece of Executive Order 115 talks about June 15th. And what it says about June 15th is talking about the non-essential personal care services that, if you remember just a couple slides ago, was in the list of businesses and operations that were required to remain closed. They lived in that list in Executive Order 110, but 115 is telling us on June 15th that part of 110 is rescinded, and so they are permitted, non-essential personal care services, businesses and operations are permitted to begin to operate across the state, all regions for that part, subject to capacity limitations and workplace safeguard requirements, okay? So as a refresher, let's talk about the regions. Next slide, please. So on Friday, we had a discussion about the entire state being in Phase 4, okay, and so why do regions still matter? Do they still matter? And this is a great example of, yes, they do still matter, and so it's important for us to remember this regional approach. So we remember way back when, as part of the My Safe Start program, the governor divided the state into 8 separate regions, and she is making reopening or loosening or potentially tightening decisions based on the information about the virus coming out of each of those areas. So if we remember, the first time that she took the regional approach was right before the Memorial Day holiday, right? So when she opened back up, regions 6 and 8 in time for the holiday, right? And so at that time, folks could leave their house or place of residence to go to a restaurant, a retail store, attend social gatherings up to 10 people. We were all of the rest of us in the other regions were pretty jealous about that, right? And so Shortly thereafter, the rest of the regions, we were allowed to open up shopping by appointment, among other things, a little while later. And then even further after that, we had Executive Order 110 that we all moved to phase 4, okay? So that's a little bit of the evolution. Again, taking that regional approach in the beginning, the rest of the regions kind of catching up, and now we see going back and taking the regional approach for the next step. So as we talk about the next step, next slide, please. We revisit this graphic here that discusses the stages or the phases of the My Safe Start plan. So on Friday, we talked about that the entire state was in phase 4, this improving stage, and so we were moving away from kind of a stay-at-home mentality to it's still safer at home, but the restrictions are loosening, and the types of loosening that we can all expect to see in each of the phases are listed here in the graphic. And so consistent with what's here in the graphic, Executive Order 110 certainly did lift some of the restrictions on some of what the governor is calling lower risk businesses, and we knew how that impacted retail and offices, but telework remain required, all of those pieces. So now we start to look at phase 5, this containing, if we could go back one slide, please, this containing section here. We know now, right, that on June 10th, regions 6 and 8 get to move to phase 5. And so we'll talk about what that is, what types of loosenings 115 directs regions 6 and 8 to do. Next slide, please. But before we get into this, I do just, and you'll see this slide a couple times in our presentation today, because Mary and I want to be really clear, because Executive Order 115 and 114 are actually a little bit confusing in the way that they are written, right? So only regions 6 and 8 are moving to phase 5 on June 10th. And so at that time, Executive Order 115's rules will start to apply to them, but Executive Order 110's rules continue to apply to the rest of the regions, so regions 1 through 5 and 7. So if as you're listening to this presentation and that's the only piece of information you might take away, that's a really good start because it will help you decipher what pieces of 115 are of immediate concern to you today, and what pieces may not apply to you or your workplace just yet. Okay, next slide, please. So let's go ahead and talk about what some of those rules for regions 6 and 8 will look like come Wednesday, right, June 10th. So the first piece, remote work. So you remember, for those of us who are still in phase 4, the remote work piece is a requirement, right? So where work can be performed remotely, it must be performed remotely. That's where we live in phase 4. For those moving to phase 5, we see a wording change there, right? Work that can be performed remotely should be performed remotely. So what does that mean? Okay, how should I, okay, Sandy, I understand the difference. Maybe I understand the difference between, you know, the word must and should, but what does that practically mean for my business? So again, just as a reminder, June 10th, remote work remains the requirement for regions 1 through 5 and 7, and remote work in regions 6 and 8 move from a must to a should. So practically, what might that look like? So the language still indicates that where remote work is possible, there is still certainly a preference, right, should, a preference for remote work, even if it is not the rule anymore, right, even if no longer the rule. And so as you think about, if you are in region 6 and 8, and this taking effect just here in a couple of days for you, as you think about what that means for your current workforce who's working remotely, it's important to consider that it's likely that you still have a large contingent of employees who have pause, right, about returning to in-person work. And so your organization, you'd want to make any requirement for those folks to return to in-person work defensible. And what I mean with that word, defensible in the sense that you want to have reasoning that is easily explainable to your employees in terms of the business reason that you're kind of flipping that switch, right? So easily explainable to your employees so that they can understand why they're being called back. So the transition from must to should, in my mind, right, becomes more of an employee relations issue with the should language really than a legal requirement that we had with the must language. And so the other piece you want to make sure to spend some time thinking about is your messaging from an organizational standpoint, right? So your messaging on this requirement, who's coming back, when people are coming back, if it's optional, required, all of those pieces, is that consistent with the messaging your organization is doing surrounding the pandemic generally, right? And so overall, when and whether, if you're in 6 and 8, region 6 and 8, when and whether you bring those folks back who are working remotely now, in the cadence that you do that, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all type of plan for every employer. It's going to be very specific to what makes sense for you. And of course, as Mary will talk about a little bit later, certainly if you are an organization who has had very, very limited in-person work throughout the pandemic, it's also an important consideration to go, okay, if we're going to call everybody back on June 10th, there's a whole host of things that you need to do to prepare your workplace to welcome back in-person workers from a pandemic preparedness, social distancing mitigation measures standpoint. So those are all important pieces to understand as well. So if you are listening and you are not in Region 6 and 8, I hope that you didn't tune out just there, because why I think this particular discussion has more general applicability is because what we've seen so far, right, is that we think maybe Executive Order 115 is kind of a glimpse of what Phase 5 of the My Safe Start plan might look like for the rest of the regions, right, 1 through 5 and 7, in terms of potential timing and potential cadence and progression of what and when things are able to lift. So as we just talked about, kind of this move from must on remote work to should, because it's not as straightforward as you can or you can't, so you do or you don't necessarily, it probably makes sense for the rest of us to start thinking about how our organization will handle moving to should type of language for remote work, right? That's probably time well spent to spend some time thinking about that now, okay? So moving on from remote work. So now let's talk about in-person work. As I mentioned just a minute ago, if you are in an organization that hasn't been doing any in-person work, or as more folks start to come back, it's a 115 tells us that your employees are now going to be subject to the Workplace Safeguards and Executive Order 114, which Mary is going to spend a lot of time talking about now. But for those who've listened to other webinars, you might be thinking, well, what about Executive Order 97? And so Mary will talk about how 97 and 114 go together. So no worries, hold tight onto those thoughts. And then, of course, 115, as we think about our social lives, right? So a couple things haven't changed, right? So we still have expectations for CDC social distancing, and we still have face covering requirements. Okay, next slide, please. So as we look at specifically gatherings, performance, and events, that heading in Executive Order 115, we have some new requirements here. And so Region 6 and 8 get to implement these requirements starting later this week on June 10th. So indoor limitations now up to 50 people. The rest of us stay at the 10-person limit, and the outdoor limits become up to 250 people, while the rest of us stay at 100. So increases there. 115 also talks about indoor arcade, bowling alley, cinema, climbing facility, convention center, performance space, meeting hall, nightclub, sports arena, theater, or small indoor venues. So those are all very specifically listed there, and I think that's intentional, but the precursor there, indoor, right? So that's an important qualifier there. In regions 6 and 8, those are permitted to open on June 10th if those facilities put measures in place to allow their patrons to maintain the 6-foot rule, right? That social distance piece, and whether that's visual cues or limited seating, all of those pieces, and subject to capacity limits, right? So number of people in the venue to 25% of maximum capacity, or to 250 people, whichever is smaller. So if you are one of those venues, or you're wanting to go to one of those venues, right, know that those are the capacity requirements that will apply starting later this week. Next slide, please. So now let's look at outdoor spaces. So outdoor concert spaces, racetracks, sports arenas, stadiums, or similar venue. Again, regions 6 and 8, those can open on the 10th. Again, subject to some capacity and social distancing restrictions. So again, to the extent that they, those venues can allow social distancing for patrons, and subject to a capacity limit of 25% of the maximum capacity, or 500 people, whichever is smaller. So the smaller of those two numbers are the capacity limit there. Now we talk about in 115, also this is interesting here, incidental gatherings of persons that are not subject to the indoor and outdoor limits, right? So we've all, right, thought about, or at least maybe not we all have, I certainly have thought about, well, gosh, how do, what if I'm going to the airport? How do these indoor capacity limits apply to me? Am I not going to be able to get on my flight? How are those pieces? So Executive Order 115 specifically says these specific places are not subject to those capacity restrictions. So that's important for us to know. Airport, bus station, a factory floor, restaurant, shopping mall, public pool, and workplace. So at least for some of those listed there, that may be because they are subject to capacity restrictions in other executive orders, but otherwise those indoor-outdoor capacity limitations do not apply to those places. Next slide, please. Continuing to talk about the rules for Region 6 and 8 on June 10th, outdoor parks and recreation facilities are permitted to be open if, first, if being open is not prohibited by local regulation. So we want to always remember that as we talk about the statewide executive orders, it's also important for you to check your locality public health orders, because just because some of these places can be open under executive order, there may be something local that's restricting them from doing so, or certainly these organizations could just generally be making the decision that they're not yet prepared to open. So always important to keep those in the back of our mind. So outdoor parks and recreation, again, as long as they're not prohibited by local regulation, they can enable the patrons to maintain the 6-foot rule. And where the 6-foot rule cannot be maintained, those areas must remain closed. So that's a little bit different language than we've seen before. Public outdoor, public swimming pools, regions 6 and 8 can open on June 10th if, and there's different capacity limitations for outdoor and indoor pools. So outdoor, they must limit capacity to 50%, indoor must limit capacity to 25%. So I'll pause there just for a second. For those of us who are not in region 6 and 8, the indoor public pool piece opening is new, right? So again, as even though we might be kind of bummed that 115 doesn't apply to us yet, we can see what those differences might be and what may be in our future. Because of course, in regions 1 through 5 and 7, indoor pools are not permitted to be open at all under Executive Order 110. So that's an important note. And then still in Regions 6 and 8, residential travel and troop camps must remain closed. So that is unchanged even for Regions 6 and 8 in Executive Order 115. That still is the same default rule there as appeared in Executive Order 110. So next slide, please. So again, you'll see this slide again. So it's a really important point and some things about Executive Order 115 that I want to be your main takeaways. Again, only Regions 6 and 8 are moving to Phase 5 on June 10th, and then at that time, the rules in Executive Order 115 will apply to them. But until we know differently, right, Executive Order 110's rules continue to apply to the rest of the regions, 1 through 5 and 7. But the other piece that we know about Regions 1 through 5 and 7 is that on June 15th, personal care services get to open across the state, subject to Executive Order 110's rules as well. So at the end of the day, again, might not seem as exciting as we thought, and certainly, again, some of the press over the weekend in terms of how they have described Executive Order 115. If history kind of repeats itself, we think that this is probably a really good glimpse at what Phase 5 might look like for Regions 1 through 5 and 7 when they get to move to that place, and indicate the potential timing of when other regions might make that progression. So if we look back, right, Regions 6 and 8 moved to Stage 4 on May 22nd, and they're moving to Stage 5 or Phase 5 on June 10th, so about a 2.5-week gap there. And so for those of us that had some loosening effective June 1st, maybe that's the same type of cadence that we can expect in Regions 1 through 5 and 7. I don't know, but those are important data points for us to track and consider, right? So that's important. Personal care services, again, continuing to be subject to the rules in Executive Order 110 on the 15th, or whenever you open, right? If you're not ready to unlock the doors and flip on the light switch on June 15th, of course, that's perfectly fine. But when you are, you know that those are the rules you should be looking to figure out how you need to open in terms of capacity limits and so on and so forth. Mary's going to spend a lot of time talking about workplace safeguards that are in effect for all regions and some of the regions. And so I would encourage you to even go back. Miller Johnson, of course, we've done a number of webinars about the workplace safeguard requirements. And so as Mary goes forward and talks about some of them, or even as you heard us just kind of briefly talk about Executive Order 110, we didn't do a deep dive into all of those pieces because previous webinars have done that. So we would direct you back to those webinars and those presentations for some of the meat on the bone, so to speak, if you have any questions about those specific requirements. And of course, our resource center is equipped with preparedness plans and process flows and communications as it relates to any of your brand new lifting restriction requirements, right? So if you're in Region 6 and 8 and there's something as an employer, there's something that you're able to do now that you haven't, we have those resources available to assist you. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Mary to maybe answer some questions if we've received any, but certainly dive into Executive Order 114.
Good morning, everyone. As Sandy was talking about Executive Order 115, we want to continue to think of 115 and 110 as our quote-unquote stay-home orders. So if you look at those orders, you're not going to find the rules of the game so much for your business and how to protect your employees. You're going to look to those orders about, okay, what can and can't I do as far as, okay, if I'm this business, can I be open? If I'm that business, am I still closed? Or for recreational purposes, can I do this or can I do that? So Executive Order 110 and 115 continue to be what can and what can't I do on a personal and business level? Executive Order 114 is, you want to think of that order as the rules of the game. So that is workers' protection. And what gets tricky about that is, next slide please, is that Executive Order 114 completely rescinds Executive Order 97. So 97 has been in our COVID-19 world around for a bit, and we all, not only on the webinars, but lots of business owners have spent a lot of time on 96 or 97 and its predecessors, because those were, okay, if I can operate as a business, what are the rules of the game that I need to operate? So I'm going to continue to refer to 114 as the workers' rights order, because when you look at that order, it will not tell you whether you can operate or not, and that's what's tricky. So, for example, that order will talk about what you need to do if you're a sports and entertainment facility, but those types of entities are only applicable to Regions 6 and 8. So you would have to look at another executive order to see if it would be applicable in your area, if you can operate in your area. So it continues to be confusing, because you will not find any timelines or time frames in Executive Order 114. You'll have to refer to another order regarding time frames. Next slide, please. So let's take a deep dive into Executive Order 114, because that did rescind Executive Order 97, and that was the order that we spent a lot of time on. At least if you were listening to Friday's webinar, we spent a lot of time on 97. The good news is that a lot of the information and the instructions in 97 did transfer over to Executive Order 114. So we don't have a brand new set of rules that everyone needs to adhere to, but there are quite a few different changes, or there have been changes to the Executive Order rules, and then there certainly have been a lot of additions, anticipating that other industries are going to be opening soon. So, for example, Executive Order 114 contains information about sporting events and personal care services and gyms, but remember, those that are authorized to operate can only do so under other executive orders. So when you're looking at 114, you don't want to take the instructions listed in there as allowing you to operate your business. You still need to look at Executive Order 115 and 110 to see if your business can operate, and it will be largely depending on what region you're at. So, and in addition, there are some areas of Executive 114 that specifically exclude Regions 6 and 8. So if you're operating up north, you don't want to think, okay, everything in 114 applies to me because I have moved into phase 5 and I have a lot more flexibility regarding what businesses are open. So for example, if you're a retail store in Regions 6 and 8, you no longer have occupancy requirements per square foot that the rest of us still need to adhere to. Otherwise, you want to think of Executive Order 114 as the new and improved Executive Order 97. You will see the sections are all similarly headed. Section 1, of course, applies to all industries. So those are instructions that regardless of whether you're in construction, a manufacturing, an office, all of those are the basic minimum that you find in Section 1 requirements that you must meet. And then, of course, the subsequent sections are if you're in a different type of industry that the executive order specifically calls out, like manufacturing or retail, then you have additional requirements that you must meet above and beyond Section 1, which are the basic requirements. Next slide. And just a reminder, we said this again on Friday, but it is worth repeating that Executive Order 114 is not a one-stop shop. So when you think of the world of executive orders, it is not just 110, 114, and 115. Those certainly are all still applicable, but if you fit in these different industries, you'll want to continue to look at those executive orders to meet their requirements in there. And specifically, in Executive Order 114, Governor did call out Executive Order 109 specifically that was still in effect until the state of emergency is over. So certainly these executive orders that are listed here are all still applicable. Next slide. And the same thing applies to Executive Order 114. Now, I just said, hey, we need to treat that as workers' protection, but it's still not a one-stop shop for employees' protection. So as you go through your employees in different scenarios, for sure you want to go and make sure you're compliant with Executive Order 114, but depending upon the circumstances that are presented to you regarding a particular employee, you'll also want to refer to the new federal law, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. You'll want to refer to that Executive Order 36 that's still in play, and remember that is one where an employee does not need to provide you with a doctor's note to confirm they have COVID-19 or that they have symptoms of COVID-19 or that they were in close contact with somebody who had symptoms or are positive to COVID-19. It also requires you to provide them with some type of time off of work without discipline or termination. So you'll want to look at that as well. Executive Order 114 largely does not talk about disciplining employees. They largely talk about the rules of the game to make sure that you as employers are safeguarding and creating a safe workplace for your employees to work in. And then, of course, you'll want to remember that you want to check your local public health orders because a lot of local officials are adding additional requirements regarding their specific area. Next slide. Okay, so let's go into some of the changes and updates of Executive Order 114. So Section 1, we did see some changes to that being made, and I'll just call out a few. I'm not going to go through all of Section 1. If you want to refer and have a refresher of Executive or Section 1, certainly you'll want to look at the executive order, but you also can look at or listen to the PowerPoints that are on our website or the recordings that are regarding Executive Order 114 and 97 regarding those sections. So Section 1, in addition to your COVID-19 preparedness plan and all of the multiple requirements, there has been a change in our requirements concerning positive test protocol. Now remember, a positive test protocol means that you have a COVID-19 positive employee. They've informed you that they are COVID-19 positive, and then you as an employer have certain requirements that you need to meet. In Executive Order 97, it was within 24 hours of you receiving notice that you had an employee that was COVID-19 positive, you needed to notify the local public health department, and you needed to notify coworkers, contractors, and suppliers who may have come in contact with the COVID-19 positive employee. This has changed now to, well, you still are required to notify employees, coworkers, and contractors and the like within 24 hours. The 24-hour requirement has, for a local public health department, changed to immediately. So what does that practically mean? At least in my world, immediately when you're dealing with another entity, that usually means within 24 hours. So certainly the governor did not think that 24 hours was quick enough, so immediately should mean immediately. That is the first thing that you do. After you receive a word of a COVID-19 positive employee, you dial the local public health department and allow and provide them with notification. In addition, she changed some requirements for return to work. So you have the positive protocol. You have been informed that your employee is COVID-19 positive. You immediately have contacted the local health department. And then within 24 hours, you have notified the coworkers and others who may have, and you've quarantined those that were in close contact. And you've done all of the things that you're required to do in your protocol regarding shutting down a department, a facility. You've done enhanced disinfectant, all of those things. But now when you're looking to return this employee that has received that COVID-19 positive, the rules of the game here have changed a bit. So they're only allowed to return to work when they are no longer infectious, of course, according to CDC guidelines, and they are released from any quarantine or isolation by the local public health department. So this presupposes that when you notify the local public health department, you will stay in contact and they will stay in contact with you and the COVID-19 positive employee, and you will be in conjunction and they will tell you when they will be released from isolation and they can come back to work. Next slide, please. And so there are other little subtle nuances regarding positive test protocol, includes protocols for sending employees home and for temporary closures of all or part of the workplace. That used to say work site. It has now changed to workplace to allow for deep cleaning. So it's a little bit of an initial head scratcher of what's the difference between work site and workplace. So the only thing that comes to mind is work site usually means a particular facility, and workplace perhaps could be more transient into other avenues where somebody is working, not necessarily where the facility, the work site, the physical site is. Section 5 has been changed. This applies just to research laboratories. Visiting scholars used to be prohibited as non-essential in-person visitors, and that is no longer the case with Executive Order 114. Next slide. And as we move on to Section 6 is retail. So remember, Section 1 applies to all employers. And then we go down the sections to see if any of your industries have been called out, and if they are, additional rules. So Section 6 deals with retail, and the governor in this executive order just made it official, even though in prior executive orders that has said libraries and museums are subject to the retail additional heightened requirements. She just slotted retail to include libraries and museums, and again, reinforced dedicated shopping time and for vulnerable populations. And then Section 7 for offices, and this applies to all regions, is this infamous water fountain, which we received so many questions on, where the executive order previously, if you were in office, you needed to turn off your water fountains. It's no longer a requirement to lock your conference rooms or to turn off your water fountains. So you can do with that as you see fit, but wanted to mention that. In addition, and this is where if you are in Region 6 and 8 and you have operations there and you have remote work that changes from a must to a should, as Sandy was indicating if you operate an office in Region 6 and 8, even though the remote work is from a must to a should, you must use virtual meetings whenever possible. So there are still certain industries that have a stronger requirement for the virtual world than other industries. Next slide. And then Yahoo, right? As of today, we can join up north in regions 1 through 5 and 7 for going to restaurants and bars. And as we see that opening today, there are new requirements. Nothing to really be completely blown away by, because these seem just to be clearing up some words, but clarification that if you work in a restaurant or bar, if you own one, you need to require not only your hosts and servers, but all staff to wear face covering in the dining area. And the same thing with limiting the number of employees, where they previously had listed shared spaces, kitchens, break rooms, and the like. They specifically have included host stands now. Next slide. And then this one, even though at first blush it seems to only apply to restaurants and bars, and that may still be the case, this is worth a small discussion on, because even though it is found in the restaurant and bar section, it does provide a new definition of COVID-19 symptoms. And it does not say that these COVID-19 symptoms are only found in restaurants and bars. And although, again, that this definition is found in the restaurant and bar section, this may be a precursor or a highlight that the COVID-19 definition for symptoms may be changing. And so if that were true, then of course all requirements under Section 1 regarding training, preparedness, plan, and the like would need to be changed. But until we get further clarification, I just want to note for you all today that there does seem to be a new definition of COVID-19 symptoms. It's only found in the restaurant section right now, but until we get further clarification, this could be a highlight of what may come in other industries. But for right now, you must close your restaurant immediately if an employee shows symptoms of COVID-19, which is as following. And this was an intentional different symptoms because the Executive Order 114 actually struck out the previous. Remember, the previous one was a fever, atypical cough, and atypical shortness of breath. Now, fever is still there, but it is not in and of itself. The symptom is a new onset of cough or a new onset of chest tightness, or two of the following: fever, measured or subjective, chills, rigors, myalgia, headache, sore throat, or taste deficiency. So some of these are a little bit of a head scratcher. So certainly if you're working in a restaurant, you don't want someone to be there making your food if they have a fever, even if that's the only thing that they have. And I'm certain that other requirements would disqualify that employee from working, but fever no longer, at least in the restaurant world, is not enough to be indicative of a COVID-19 symptom of and of itself. So rigors is just a fancy word because we don't talk like this in regular common speak of medical, but rigors is a fancy word of sudden chills, and myalgia is aches in that sort of thing. So you'll want to pay attention to this. You may want to, if you have your executive order, just put an asterisk here, because this one may just stay here and be inconsistent with the rest of the symptoms of COVID-19, or the governor may clean up the rest of the symptoms of COVID-19 for other industries, and this may be our new COVID-19 symptom definition. So for right now, it's with restaurants and bars until we get further clarification. Next slide. Okay, so here it gets a little tricky because there are new sections that are added. And so she's added new sections under section 10, 11, 12, and 13. And we will quickly go through that during our remaining time today. But what gets tricky here is some of the sections only apply to region 6 and 8 because they are moving into the next phase, and some sections apply to everybody starting on Monday. So if you are in home services, including cleaners, repair person, painters, and the like, and if you're a repair person or painter and you haven't already classified yourself as construction and have been working, starting on June 10, if you are located up north in region 6 and 8, you can begin providing in-home services. And what will be a common theme through all of these new additions is accurate record keeping. So remember these new sections. So if you're a painter that's just getting up and running up north June 10 and you think, okay, section 10 is what I need to comply with, you want to remember you also need to comply with section 1 that applies to every industry. So these heightened requirements are in addition to that. But for these in-home services, they'll want to maintain accurate appointment records. And of course, you need that for tracing purposes if there is a COVID-19 positive result along the way regarding either a customer or an employee. So I note the requirements here on this slide, but for the sake of time and that these requirements are pretty black and white regarding the clarity of this, I am not going to go through all of them on the slide. So next slide regarding in-home services, you'll want to make sure that prior to entering the home, you inquire with the customer whether anyone in the household has been diagnosed with COVID-19, and if so, you must reschedule for a different time. Next slide, please. And then again, if you are an in-home service, you'll want to limit the number of employees inside the home, which is different from other industries, whatever region you're in. There's really not a limitation regarding what employees you can bring back to work except for the remote work requirement, or if you're in different industries. So this one still has a limitation of what employees you can bring back and be in the home. So that is what I have to say for the in-home services. Next slide, we're going to talk about Section 11. So Section 11 is rather unique because this section doesn't just apply to up north regions 6 and 8. This applies to all regions. Every region starting on June 15, next Monday. If you own one of these services, you'll be back in business, and if you have been coveting these services, like getting a haircut or a massage or a tattoo, you'll be able to do so starting next Monday. So under these, it will not be business as normal like with all industries. They have additional requirements such as keeping accurate records, posting signs at the door. Next slide. If you're going to get a haircut or massage and you're used to that personal feel of being offered refreshments or a magazine to look at, that will no longer be allowed under this executive order. Next slide. And if you are performing these types of services or getting these types of services, you'll want to make sure that you bring your face covering along because it is required for all employees and customers to wear face coverings at all times. And if during the service it requires a customer to remove their face covering, so for example, you need to get your hair cut in the back and there's the face covering is prohibiting that and you need to remove it, at that time your stylist needs to put on a face shield or goggles in addition to their face covering so that all of the access points for COVID-19, which remember your eyes, your nose, your mouth, are covered. Next slide. And remember in section 11 regarding the haircuts and the tattoos and the massages, that is applied to everyone. And Executive Order 110, that's still applicable for most everything. If you get to section 12C, you'll want to make sure to remember that Executive Order 115 rescinded 12C. 12C in Executive Order 110 prohibited the haircuts and tattoos and the like, and Executive Order 115 rescinded just that specific section, 12C of Executive Order 110. And then in addition to rounding out this type of industry, of course, as you would expect, they're required to install barriers and cooperate with local public health department if there's a confirmed COVID-19. But for a lot of salons, this has been very good news. There are a lot of more restrictive requirements that were both presented to the governor and were talked about that did not make it into this executive order. So that shows just how good our numbers are starting throughout Michigan regarding COVID-19. Next slide. And then we get to section 12. And section 12, again, now we bubble back into, this only applies to region 6 and 8. So section 10 only applies to region 6 and 8. Section 11 applied to everyone starting Monday, and then section 12, which talks about sports and entertainment facilities, only applies to region 6 and 8. So if you're in regions 1 through 5 or 7, this is still not allowed. But if you operate a sports or entertainment facility, or you're going to go to one up north, you can expect additional requirements such as posting signs outside the entrance informing customers not to enter, establish crowd limiting measures. Of course, face mask coverings will be required, and physical dividers are marked to make sure that social distancing is adhered to. Next slide. And you will also see that there will be limited seating occupancy to the extent that folks not in the same household can maintain 6 feet separation. So there will be a lot of, I imagine, empty seats between patrons, and they will have to mark different exits and different sections to maintain that social distancing. Next slide. And then there's additional requirements regarding employees who will be interacting with folks coming in to enjoy those facilities and entertainment to make sure and monitor compliance with COVID-19 protocols. And for sure, if anybody is COVID-19 symptomatic, then they would not be allowed to enter, along with different requirements as you would expect now that we've been living in the COVID-19 world for a while regarding disinfecting surfaces, cleaning, and self-service food and drink options will be closed. So while you can go and be entertained, you will not be able to go and get food and drinks. Next slide. And then we get to the last section that is new, and again, this only applies to up north. So if you are a gymnasium or a fitness center listening today and you are located in Grand Rapids or Kalamazoo or one of the places in regions 1 through 5 or 7, you are still closed until further notice. There isn't a date yet, but if you are a gymnasium or a gym up north, starting on Wednesday, you can start operating. So again, there are heightened requirements, as you can imagine. These are previous social activities and previous activities that were deemed too risky and too at risk to contract COVID-19 to be allowed. But because phase 5 falls now on region 6 and 8 with additional heightened safety measures, they are allowed. So for example, if you go in, you'll see additional signs. If you are an operator of this, you'll need to take accurate record. One thing that is different is that we've been seeing 6 feet barriers all around. In this industry, actually, workout stations must be 10 feet between individuals. And I suspect it's because folks are exercising, sweating, breathing hard, and they need that additional barrier between them so that COVID-19 germs or the virus is not spread, and they think 6 feet is not appropriate for this industry. Next slide. You're also required to reduce class size if you cannot have that 6 feet separation or 10 feet where it is required. And of course, all of the things that every industry regarding cleaning and sanitization, and in this industry, it's even more heightened. Next slide. And if you're in a gym, you will need to regularly clean and disinfect public areas, locker rooms, and restrooms, and close any steam rooms and sauna. And again, really look at your building to see if there's additional safety measures that you could do regarding ventilation or circulation of the outdoor air, so that you know, good air is coming in and fresh air is coming in to limit the virus spread. Next slide. So those are all of the new requirements under Executive Order 114. And remember, you'll want to think of 114 as the workers' protection, or what the rules of the games are if you are operating or operating soon under those industries. And so if you are a gymnasium or a fitness center and you don't fall under Section 6 or 8, as Sandy said, it'll be time well spent in the next week or two to make sure that you're fully compliant with Section 1 and then with that Section 13, so that when there is an executive order that allows your business to operate, that you are ready to go. And so we're going to end here with a summary of important dates. And next slide, please. So today, remember, all region restaurants and bars are open with restrictions. Same thing for outdoor public swimming pools. I know for kids that is a welcome news. And day camps and libraries and museums are now open, and of course, they all have different restrictions and requirements. And then on Wednesday, for up north, region 6 and 8, they are going to enjoy phase 5, and the rules of Executive Order 115 will apply to them. And 115 is largely the most relaxed executive order that we have seen. So they will start enjoying that executive order. For the rest of us that are in regions 1 through 5 and 7, we will be able to enjoy some personal care services such as haircuts, tattoos, massages, and the like. But rules for us are not Executive Order 115, but 110. And Executive Order 114 will apply to, for the most part, all regions. But for us, regarding Executive Order 110, that is our stay-home order for Traverse City. And up north, Executive Order 115 is their stay-home order. 114 largely applies to every region. And again, that doesn't tell you if you can operate. It only tells you the rules of the game when you can operate. And another important date to to pay attention to, although it is widely anticipated that June 19 will be extended, is June 19 is the end date for the declaration of the state of emergency in Michigan. That is when it's set to expire. It is a little over 10 days away from that, and if history repeats itself, that will be extended. The governor has usually extended those on a 2 to 3 week basis, and because most regions are not into phase 5, that is largely anticipated that the June 19 date will be kicked out at a minimum a few weeks. So we will stay tuned for that notice and to see what happens with that June 19 date. Other than that, that is going to be the end of our presentation. Sandy, did you have any additional comments before we end this webinar?
Nope, no additional questions have been submitted, and so I think hopefully we've answered some questions today and provided some clarity.
All right, thank you, and everybody have a good Monday.